Over 30 years have gone by since one gunshot broke the peaceful rhythms of Long Island suburbs and sparked one of the most notorious tabloid scandals of the 1990s. However, for Meri Buttafuoco, time has merely changed her memories rather than erased them. Meri is now speaking with clarity, fortitude, and a hard-won sense of perspective, not with resentment. 34 years after surviving a shooting that almost killed her and captured the nation's attention. In the past, the Amy Fisher controversy was viewed as sensationalized entertainment that combined violence, sex, treachery, and media fixation. Real individuals were reduced to cartoon characters in headlines: the tragic wife, the cheating husband, and the teenage temptress. However, beneath the labels was a woman struggling to survive, recover, and regain her identity from a narrative she never requested to be a part of. Meri Buttafuoco's voice breaks through the din of history today, redefining the scandal rather than reliving it. The day it all changed, Meri Buttafuoco entered her Massapequa, New York, home on a summer afternoon in 1992, anticipating nothing more than a typical moment. Rather, she encountered Amy Fisher, a teenage girl she had never met. A gun was raised in a matter of seconds. There was a gunshot. Meri fell to the ground. She was gravely injured and struggling for her life when the bullet hit her in the head. It was unclear to the doctors whether she would live. Those who followed the news at the time recall the shock, but many were unaware of the extent of the ensuing trauma. Surviving was just the start for Meri. From personal anguish to public display, the journalists poured down on Meri as she lay in a hospital bed. Every aspect of her life, her marriage, and her suffering was extensively covered by reporters. What surfaced was a narrative that was widely reported by tabloids. The 17-year-old Amy Fisher allegedly shot Meri in an effort to kill her after having an affair with her husband, Kody Brown. The story took off. Newspapers, talk programs, and cable television made the case a national preoccupation. The production of television films was hurried. Jokes made late at night minimized the violence. As though she were a fictitious character rather than a real lady recuperating from a gunshot wound, strangers discussed Meri marriage, her decisions, and her value. In retrospect, Meri has characterized that time as horrible and strange. In subsequent interviews, she has said, "I was fighting for my life, and the world was treating it like entertainment. Being physically fit was only half the fight." Meri suffered significant damage from the gunshot, including hearing loss and facial paralysis. Simple things like eating, smiling, and speaking clearly became difficult. The healing process was drawn out, difficult, and emotionally taxing. The treachery, however, was equally painful. While recuperating from an attempted murder, she learned about her husband's extramarital affair, which left a psychological scar that would never heal. Suddenly, there was no longer any stability, safety, or trust. Meri has talked about how lonely she felt at the time. Few people questioned how she was actually functioning, despite the public's incessant discussion of the scandal. The cruel lens of the media landscape of the 1990s, was different. It was more aggressive, less constrained, and heavily influenced by sensationalism. Meri went from being a person to a headline. She has been open about how harmful that exposure was in retrospect. She was examined rather than given privacy. She was examined rather than treated with kindness. Her trauma turned into contentment. Has admitted that decades later, society has gradually become more conscious of the treatment of victims. However, the wounds from that time still exist. She has stated, "I didn't just lose my sense of safety. I no longer have the right to mourn in peace." Redefining the story 34 years later, Meri Buttafuoco speaks with power and distance. Though it has honed her perception of what really mattered, and what never did, time has dulled some edges. She no longer lets the story's depiction of her darkest day define who she is. Rather, she presents it as a single episode in a far more extensive journey. She now focuses more on survival than guilt in her reflections. Resilience is more important than controversy. She stresses that recovery is not a straight line and that forgiveness, when it occurs, is about individual autonomy rather than justifying wrongdoing. Regarding Amy Fisher, a complex viewpoint. Meri's response to questions on Amy Fisher today is noticeably different from what the general public may anticipate. The unadulterated rage of the early years has vanished. Something more subtle takes its place. Meri doesn't downplay the crime. She doesn't change the past. However, she also acknowledges that Amy Fisher was a teenager at the time immature, impetuous, and involved in an adult scenario that she might not have completely comprehended. It was difficult to adopt that viewpoint. Decades of introspection and emotional labor were required. Meri Jo has hinted that carrying hatred was exhausting. "I didn't let go for anyone else, I did it for myself." Growth, accountability, and betrayal regarding her husband's involvement in the disaster. Meri Jo has likewise been forthright. For many years, Amy Fisher was the main focus of the public discourse, frequently ignoring the adult who was in charge of the relationship. Meri Jo has been able to talk more candidly about accountability over time, emphasizing the need to hold adults accountable and the actual harm that comes from oversimplifying complicated situations. Her readiness to confront these painful realities has given the controversy a more responsible and truthful perspective. Life outside of the headlines, many people are unaware of the fact that Meri Jo Buttafuoco went on to lead a life free of scandal. She learned to live with both visible and unseen wounds while working and raising her kids. She adjusted to the restrictions of her body. Her confidence was restored. Slowly, carefully, and according to her own terms, she regained the ability to trust. The woman who is speaking now is not stuck in 1992. She is the culmination of all subsequent events. Changing the way we discuss victims, Meri Jo's thoughts coincide with a period when society is reconsidering how it handles victims of assault. Her story now seems different, not because the facts have changed, but rather because of how we see it. She asks viewers to consider empathy, self-control, and the true cost of making trauma into a show. She tells them, stories don't end when the cameras turn off. The hardest part usually starts at that point. A history of survival rather than scandal. Meri Jo Buttafuoco is taking back her tale after 34 years, not as a footnote in tabloid history, but as a symbol of perseverance. The headlines, the treachery, and the bullet don't define her. Survival, development, and the bravery to express herself on her own terms are what define her. Even though the Amy Fisher controversy will always be a part of popular culture, Meri Jo's voice gives it a personal element that it had long lacked. Reflecting on the past without being there, though she does not dispute it, Meri Jo Buttafuoco does not live in the past. Her thoughts are about honestly finishing chapters rather than rehashing wounds. She is a reminder that despite every dramatic headline, there is a real person whose life goes on long after the public's attention wanes, rather than a symbol of scandal 34 years later.